In 2025, the global oil trade reached $3 trillion. Nearly all of those transactions were settled in US dollars, the byproduct of a geopolitical pact struck in a Saudi desert in 1974. To understand that arrangement, we have to look back to 1971. Since the end of World War II, the US dollar had been backed by physical gold. Any country holding dollars could knock on America's door and swap them for the metal. But by the early 70s, the US was printing far more currency than it had gold in the vault to pay for the Cold War and social programs. Foreign nations noticed, and they started showing up to demand their gold. On August 15th, President Richard Nixon went on television and suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. This effectively severed the dollar's link to any physical commodity. It was now a fiat currency, relying entirely on global trust. A trust that was rapidly evaporating during a period of intense economic instability. The crisis deepened in October 1973 when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. When the United States backed Israel with a massive airlift of weapons, Arab oil producers utilized their primary source of leverage. They slashed crude production and initiated a total embargo against the United States. The price of a barrel tripled almost overnight. Inflation began to climb into the double digits. Across the country, gas stations ran dry, and lines stretched for blocks as American consumers faced the reality of a true energy shortage. The United States was in a corner. It had an unbacked currency, high inflation, and its most critical commodity was being used as a weapon. Washington needed a new anchor, a reason for every nation on Earth to keep buying and holding US dollars. In 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Saudi Arabia with a proposal for the Saudi king that would reshape the global economy. The terms were straightforward. The United States would provide advanced weaponry and total military protection for Saudi oil fields. In return, the Saudis would price every barrel of their oil exclusively in US dollars. Saudi Arabia agreed, and within a year, the rest of OPEC followed. This established the dollar as a global requirement. If a nation wanted to fuel its economy, it first had to acquire the currency of the United States. When nations needed oil, they were forced to trade for US dollars first, creating permanent demand. Oil exporting nations amassed billions in surplus reserves. Through petrodollar recycling, this cash was funneled directly back into US Treasury bonds, banks, and the American military. This provided the US with an exorbitant privilege. It could print money and run massive deficits because the rest of the world was effectively financing the American government and its global military presence just to keep their own lights on. By the 1980s, the dollar had become the essential infrastructure of global trade. This gave Washington the ability to use financial sanctions as a primary tool of foreign policy. Being cut off from the dollar grid was no longer just a currency issue. It was an exclusion from the global financial internet. Some leaders attempted to circumvent this system. In 2000, Saddam Hussein moved to sell Iraqi oil in euros. Following the US invasion in 2003, Iraqi oil sales were promptly returned to the dollar standard. A similar attempt occurred in 2011, when Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency for oil trade. NATO intervened months later, and the project ended with the collapse of his regime. These conflicts were driven by a tangle of local politics and security interests. However, the pattern demonstrated a specific risk to the rest of the world. Any attempt to bypass the dollar grid coincided with severe, often terminal consequences for the regime involved. For decades, this system appeared immovable. But the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine provided a catalyst for change. In an unprecedented move, the US froze $300 billion of Russia's sovereign reserves and disconnected their banks from the global payment system. Overnight, years of national savings were rendered unreachable. While it targeted the Russian economy, it also sent a signal to every other central bank. It proved that dollar reserves are only an asset as long as the United States approves of the holder's foreign policy. The reaction was immediate. China's holdings of US Treasuries began plummeting, dropping from a peak of $1.3 trillion to roughly $600 billion. At the same time, they significantly increased their gold reserves to build a hedge outside the dollar system. This sparked a broader shift in the oil market. Russia, China, and India began settling trade in local currencies. Even Saudi Arabia signaled a new willingness to move away from exclusive dollar pricing for the first time in 50 years. There is also a technological shift underway, with 1 in 4 cars sold globally in 2025 being electric. The world's structural reliance on oil and the currency required to buy it is slowly beginning to erode. The dollar remains the dominant force in global trade, but it no longer operates in a vacuum. Its monopoly is being challenged by a landscape of decentralized alternatives, suggesting that the era of a singular dollar denominated energy market is reaching its limit.